My name is David Morrison. I'm a private investigator specializing in missing persons cases. In 30 years of work, I've seen a lot of strange things. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered when I started investigating the disappearance of fisherman Ian McLeod in 1987. Ian was 62 years old. A lifelong fisherman on Loch Ness. Third generation. His grandfather had fished these waters. His father had fished these waters. Ian had been fishing here since he was 8 years old. He knew every inch of the loch, every current, every depth, every rocky outcrop beneath the surface. On September 14, 1987, Ian went out fishing at dawn like he did every morning. He took his usual boat, his usual equipment, headed to his usual spot near Urquhart Bay. His wife expected him back by noon. He never came back. The boat was found 3 days later, drifting near Fort Augustus. Engine off. Fishing gear untouched. No sign of Ian. No sign of struggle. No blood. No damage. Just an empty boat floating on calm water. The police investigated. Concluded he'd probably fallen overboard. Drowned. Body never recovered, which wasn't uncommon in Loch Ness. The water is deep. Cold. Bodies don't always surface. The case was closed within 2 weeks. But Ian's wife, Margaret, didn't believe it. Ian was too experienced to fall overboard on a calm day. Too careful. Too aware of the dangers. She insisted something else had happened. Something the police weren't seeing. She hired me 6 months after Ian disappeared. Gave me everything she had. Ian's fishing logs. His daily routines. Names of other fishermen he knew. And one other thing that made me take the case despite the cold trail. A journal entry Ian had written the night before he disappeared. The entry was brief. Only 3 sentences. But those 3 sentences convinced me there was more to this story than a simple drowning. Found it today. After all these years. Something is wrong. That was all. No explanation. No details. Just those cryptic words written in Ian's careful handwriting the night before he vanished. Found what? Wrong how? Margaret didn't know. Said Ian hadn't mentioned anything unusual that evening. Hadn't seemed disturbed or excited or worried. Had acted completely normal. And then the next morning, he'd gone fishing and never returned. I started my investigation by interviewing other fishermen who worked Loch Ness. Asked if Ian had mentioned finding anything unusual in the days before he disappeared. Most said no. Said Ian had been his usual quiet self. Hadn't talked about any discoveries or concerns. But one fisherman, an old man named Douglas who'd known Ian for 40 years, told me something different. Said Ian had been acting strange for about a week before he vanished. Distracted. Nervous. Kept looking out at the water like he was watching for something. And on September 13th, the day before he disappeared, Ian had pulled Douglas aside and asked him a strange question. If you found something impossible, Douglas said Ian had asked, something that changed everything you thought you knew, would you tell anyone? Or would you keep it secret? Douglas had laughed it off. Thought Ian was joking. But looking back, he said Ian had seemed deadly serious. Like he was wrestling with a real dilemma. Like he'd actually found something and didn't know what to do about it. That conversation, combined with the journal entry, told me Ian had discovered something the day before he disappeared. Something he thought was impossible. Something that troubled him enough to question whether he should reveal it. And then, the very next day, he'd vanished. I needed to know what he'd found. And I needed to understand why discovering it had led to his disappearance. Was he killed to keep it secret? Did he run away to protect himself? Did something happen to him because of what he discovered? Those questions drove my investigation. And what I uncovered over the following months was far stranger and more disturbing than I ever imagined. Ian McLeod had indeed found the Loch Ness Monster, had documented it, had proof that would have changed everything. But he hadn't celebrated, hadn't contacted the media or scientists. He'd written something is wrong and then disappeared. And understanding why, understanding what was wrong with what he'd found, that became my obsession. Before I reveal what I discovered, before I explain what Ian found and why it terrified him enough to abandon his entire life, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't a feel-good monster story. It's something darker. Something that explains why some discoveries should stay hidden. Why some truths are too disturbing to share. Ian McLeod found the Loch Ness Monster. And what he discovered about it made him run. Made him abandon his wife, his home, his entire life. And once you understand why, you'll never think about Loch Ness the same way again. Margaret gave me access to everything Ian had left behind. His fishing equipment, his logs, his personal belongings. And hidden in his workshop, in a locked drawer I had to force open, I found something the police had missed. A waterproof camera case. And inside that case, undeveloped film. I took the film to a professional lab in Edinburgh. Told them it was evidence in a missing persons case. They developed it carefully. And when I saw the images, I understood why Ian had hidden the film. Why he'd written something is wrong. Why he disappeared. The photographs showed the creature. Clear images. Multiple angles. Taken from maybe 20 yards away. The quality was remarkable. Ian had used professional equipment. Had steady hands despite what must have been incredible shock. The creature was real. Undeniable. Everything people had claimed for decades. Long neck. Dark skin. Massive body visible beneath the surface. Eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera. But that wasn't what disturbed me. Proof of the Loch Ness Monster should have been exciting. World-changing. These photographs alone would have made Ian famous. Wealthy. Remembered forever as the man who finally proved it existed. So why had he hidden them? Why had he seemed troubled rather than elated? Why had he written something is wrong? I studied the photographs more carefully. Looked beyond the obvious. Beyond the creature itself. And that's when I noticed something odd. In 3 of the images, there was something else visible. Something in the background. Partially obscured by water and distance, but definitely there. Another creature. A second one. Smaller. Floating on the surface. And it wasn't moving. Wasn't swimming or surfacing or diving. It was just there. Still. Lifeless. I had the lab enhance those images. Zoom in. Increase the contrast. And when I saw the enhanced versions, I felt my stomach turn. The second creature wasn't just still. It was dead. The body was bloated. Decomposing. Skin discolored. Eyes clouded. It had been dead for days. Maybe weeks. Ian had found the creature. But he'd also found a dead one. And that's what had troubled him. That's what had made him write something is wrong. Because if the creature could die, if there were bodies, then there were implications. Questions. Concerns that Ian, with his lifetime of knowledge about the loch, would have immediately understood. I went back to Margaret. Showed her the photographs. Asked if Ian had ever mentioned finding a dead animal in the water. She shook her head. Said Ian had seen plenty of dead fish over the years. Dead seals occasionally, but he'd never seemed disturbed by it. Never mentioned it specifically. This was different, I said. This was something he'd never seen before. Something that raised questions he didn't know how to answer. Margaret looked at the photographs for a long time, and then she told me something she'd remembered since we first spoke. On September 13th, the night Ian wrote that journal entry, he'd woken her up at 2 in the morning. Said he couldn't sleep. Needed to talk. But when she'd asked what was wrong, he'd just shaken his head and said he needed to think. Needed to figure something out. Had he seemed scared? I asked. Threatened? Like someone had warned him to stay quiet? No, Margaret said. He'd seemed conflicted. Like he was trying to decide something difficult. Like he had information he didn't know what to do with. That confirmed my theory. Ian had found the creature. Had proof. But instead of celebrating, he'd been disturbed by what he'd seen. The dead creature in the water had raised questions. Concerns. And he'd spent that night trying to decide what to do about it. And then the next morning, he'd gone back to the loch. Back to the same location. To see more. To confirm something. To investigate whatever was troubling him. And he'd never come back. I needed to understand what had disturbed Ian so much about finding a dead creature in the water. So I started researching. Looking for any historical accounts of dead animals found in Loch Ness. Any reports of unusual deaths. Any patterns that might explain Ian's concern. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 100 years, there had been dozens of reports of unusual animal deaths in and around Loch Ness. Fish kills. Dead birds. Seals found floating with no obvious cause of death. Most had been attributed to natural causes. Disease. Pollution. Old age. Standard explanations that didn't raise suspicion. But when I mapped them chronologically, I found a pattern. The deaths occurred in clusters. Several incidents within a few weeks. Then nothing for months or years. Then another cluster. The pattern had been repeating since at least the 1920s. Regular enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. But subtle enough that no one had connected the incidents. And the timing was significant. The clusters of deaths always occurred in late summer or early autumn. September. October. Like clockwork. Just like when Ian had found the dead creature. I started reaching out to marine biologists. Asking hypothetical questions about what could cause cyclical animal deaths in a freshwater lake. Several suggested algae blooms. Toxic bacteria. Oxygen depletion. Natural phenomena that occur seasonally and can kill fish and other aquatic life. But one biologist I spoke with, Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Edinburgh, suggested something else. She said the pattern I described sounded like predation. A large predator feeding intensively during certain seasons. The deaths I was seeing might not be disease or environmental. They might be the remains of something being hunted and killed. That stopped me cold. Because if she was right, if the deaths were from predation, then the implications were terrifying. It meant there was something in Loch Ness large enough to hunt and kill seals. Large enough to create the death pattern I'd mapped. Large enough to be the creature Ian had photographed. But it also meant something else. Something that explained why Ian had been so disturbed. If the creature was a predator, if it hunted and killed on a regular cycle, then the dead creature Ian had found might not have died from natural causes. It might have been killed. By another creature. By something larger. By something even more dangerous. I went back to the photographs. Studied the dead creature again. Looked for injuries. Signs of attack. Evidence of predation. And there, barely visible in the enhanced images, I saw them. Marks on the body. Deep gouges. Tears in the skin. The kind of damage that comes from teeth. From being attacked and killed by something with a jaw powerful enough to rip flesh. Ian had found evidence of predation. Had seen that the creatures weren't solitary. That there were at least two. And that they were hunting. Killing. Feeding on whatever they could catch. Including, possibly, each other. That's what had disturbed him. That's what had made him write something is wrong. Because the Loch Ness Monster wasn't just a mysterious creature hiding in the depths. It was a predator. Possibly an apex predator. And if it was killing seals and other large animals regularly, then there were questions about what else it might hunt. What else it might see as prey. If you're still watching, if you're understanding what I'm explaining, then you're starting to see why Ian ran. Subscribe to this channel. Share this testimony. Because what I discovered next makes the situation even more disturbing. Even more dangerous. Even more reason why Ian might have chosen to disappear rather than reveal what he'd found. The creature wasn't just hunting animals. It was hunting something specific. And the evidence suggested it had been doing so for longer than anyone realized. I needed more information. More evidence. More confirmation of what I was beginning to suspect. So I started tracking down historical accounts more systematically. Not just looking for monster sightings, but looking for disappearances, deaths, incidents that might be connected to predation. What I found was chilling. Over the past century, there had been 47 unexplained disappearances in and around Loch Ness. People who'd gone into the water and never come out. Swimmers. Divers. Boaters. Most had been ruled accidental drownings. Bodies never recovered, which was common enough not to raise suspicion. But 47 seemed high for a lake that wasn't particularly known for being dangerous. I cross-referenced the dates. And my stomach dropped. The disappearances clustered. Just like the animal deaths. Late summer. Early autumn. Multiple incidents within weeks of each other. Then nothing for months or years. The same pattern. The same cyclical timing. Predation. It had to be. The creature wasn't just hunting animals. It was hunting humans. Not constantly. Not indiscriminately. But during specific periods. When it was feeding most intensively. When it needed more substantial prey. And Ian had figured this out. Had connected the dots. Had realized that the creature he'd photographed, the predator that had killed one of its own kind, was also responsible for decades of human deaths. Deaths that had been dismissed as accidents. Deaths that no one had connected because no one believed the creature existed. That's what was wrong. That's what had terrified Ian enough to consider keeping his discovery secret. Because revealing the creature meant revealing the truth about those disappearances. Meant proving that people hadn't drowned accidentally. They'd been killed. Hunted. By something that lived in the water they'd thought was safe. I needed confirmation. Needed to talk to someone who might have direct knowledge. So I tracked down the families of some of the disappeared. Asked careful questions about the circumstances. About what their loved ones had been doing. Where they'd been. When they'd vanished. One woman I spoke with, whose brother had disappeared in 1973, told me something that confirmed everything. Her brother had been an experienced swimmer. Had been training for a long-distance charity swim across the loch. On September 15, 1973, he'd gone out for a practice swim. Calm day. Good visibility. Several people watching from shore. He'd been about 200 yards out when he went under. The witnesses said it looked like he'd been pulled down. One moment he was swimming normally, The next he was gone. They'd searched for hours. Never found a body. The coroner ruled it accidental drowning, possible cramp or heart attack. But the woman had never believed it. Her brother was young, healthy, an athlete, and the witnesses had all agreed he'd been pulled under. Not gradually, not struggling, just suddenly gone, like something had grabbed him from below. I asked if the date meant anything. September 15th. She thought about it, then said her brother's disappearance hadn't been the only one that year. 2 weeks later, a tourist had gone missing. Went out in a rental boat. Boat found empty. No trace of the tourist. And a week after that, a local fisherman had vanished. Experienced. Careful. Just gone. 3 disappearances in September 1973. All in the water. All unexplained. All during the same time period when the animal deaths clustered. When the creature was hunting most actively. When it needed more prey. The pattern was undeniable. And terrifying. The Loch Ness Monster was real. It was a predator. And it had been killing people for at least a century. Killing them during specific seasons when it fed most intensively. Killing them in ways that looked like accidents so no one ever suspected. No one ever connected. No one ever understood. Ian had figured it out. Had seen the dead creature. Had realized what it meant. Had understood that proving the monster existed also meant proving it was responsible for decades of deaths. For 47 missing people. For families that had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones. And he'd had to decide. Reveal the truth and become famous? Or keep it secret and let the deaths continue being dismissed as accidents? Let the families keep wondering? Let the creature keep hunting? That was the conflict that had kept him awake. That was the decision that had tormented him. And the next morning, he'd gone back to the loch. To see more. To confirm his suspicions. To decide once and for all what to do. And something had happened. Something that had made the decision for him. Something that had either killed him or driven him to disappear. To abandon everything. To run away from the truth he'd discovered. I needed to know what had happened on that final morning. Needed to understand what Ian had encountered. What had made him vanish. And whether he was dead or hiding. Whether he'd been killed by the creature or whether he'd chosen to disappear to protect a secret he couldn't live with sharing. I kept digging. Kept searching for anyone who might have seen something on September 14, 1987. The day Ian disappeared. And eventually, I found someone. A tourist who'd been staying at a bed and breakfast near Urquhart Bay. A woman named Patricia Bellamy who'd been visiting from England. She'd never come forward during the police investigation. Hadn't realized what she'd seen was significant. But when I tracked her down and asked about that specific date, she remembered. Said she'd been up early that morning, watching the sunrise over the loch from her window. And she'd seen something strange. A fishing boat had been anchored about 200 yards from shore. Just sitting there. No movement. No one visible on deck. She'd watched it for maybe 10 minutes. Thought it was odd that a fisherman would be just sitting there doing nothing. But then she'd gotten distracted, looked away, and when she'd looked back, the boat was moving. Not normally. Not like someone was piloting it. It was moving erratically. Almost violently. Rocking side to side. Like something was disturbing the water around it. Creating waves that were making the boat unstable. She'd watched, concerned. Thought maybe the fisherman was in trouble. Was about to call someone. But then the movement stopped. The boat stabilized. And it just sat there. Still. empty looking, for another few minutes. And then she'd seen something that had stayed with her. Something she dismissed as a trick of the light, but that had bothered her enough to remember it clearly 30 years later. The water next to the boat had bulged upward. Not a wave, not a splash, but a bulge. Like something massive was rising from underneath. And for just a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, she'd seen something break the surface. Something dark. Something large. A shape that didn't make sense. And then it was gone. Submerged. And the boat had started drifting. Slowly. Moving away from where it had been anchored. Like the anchor had been pulled loose. Or cut. Or released by someone who was no longer aboard. Patricia had watched the boat drift for a while. Then she'd gone down to breakfast. Mentioned what she'd seen to the B&B owner. The owner had said it was probably just a fisherman dealing with a tangled net or equipment problem. Nothing to worry about. And Patricia had let it go. She didn't know the boat belonged to Ian MacLeod. Didn't know a man had disappeared that day. Didn't know she'd witnessed something connected to an investigation. She'd just seen something odd and moved on with her vacation. But her testimony was crucial. It confirmed Ian had gone back to the same location. Had anchored where he'd found the creature before. Had been waiting. Watching. Investigating. And something had happened. Something had disturbed his boat. Something large had surfaced next to him. And then Ian had vanished. Was he pulled under? Killed by the creature he'd been photographing? Or had he seen something so disturbing that he deliberately cut his anchor and let the boat drift while he swam to shore somewhere else? Had he staged his own disappearance? I didn't know. But Patricia's account gave me something to work with. A timeline. A location. Evidence that something had happened to Ian's boat. Something connected to the creature. Something that had resulted in his disappearance. I needed to find out if Ian was dead or alive. If he'd been killed or if he'd run. And if he'd run, I needed to understand why. What had he seen in those final moments? What had the creature done that was so disturbing it had driven him to abandon his entire life? Those questions drove me deeper into the investigation. Deeper into the mystery. And what I discovered in the next phase of my work was so disturbing, so horrifying, that I almost wished I'd never started looking. Because Ian hadn't just found a predator. He'd found something worse. Something that explained not just the deaths, but why they happened the way they did. Why the creature hunted during specific seasons. Why it targeted certain people. Why it had been doing this for over a century. The truth was more terrible than I'd imagined. And once I understood it, I understood why Ian had run. Why he'd chosen disappearance over revelation. Why he'd written something is wrong and then vanished forever. I needed to understand the creature's hunting pattern more precisely. So I went back through every disappearance I'd identified. 47 cases over 100 years. And I mapped them not just chronologically, but geographically. Where exactly had each person vanished? Were there patterns in location as well as timing? What I found was disturbing. The disappearances clustered not just temporally but spatially. Certain areas of the loch saw multiple incidents. Urquhart Bay, the deep water near Invermariston, the channel between Fort Augustus and Foyers. These weren't random locations. They were specific hunting grounds. Places where the creature returned year after year during its feeding season. And Ian's usual fishing spot, the location where he'd anchored that final morning, was right in the center of the most active zone. The area with the highest concentration of disappearances. He'd been fishing there for decades. Had probably seen the creature multiple times over the years without realizing what it was. without understanding the danger. But once he'd photographed it, once he'd found the dead creature and understood it was a predator, he would have realized something horrifying. He'd been fishing in a hunting ground. Had been putting himself in danger every single day for years. Had been lucky to survive as long as he had. That realization alone might have been enough to disturb him. To make him right something is wrong. But I suspected there was more. Something specific he discovered that final morning. Something that had pushed him from disturbed to desperate. From conflicted to vanished. I went back to the photographs. Studied them obsessively. Looking for anything I'd missed. Any detail that might explain what had terrified Ian so completely. And finally, I saw it. Something I'd overlooked because I'd been focused on the creatures themselves. The background. The water. In several of the images, there was a disturbance pattern. Ripples spreading outward from a point about 50 yards from the boat. And at the center of those ripples, barely visible in the murky water, was another shape. Partially submerged. Moving. I had the lab enhance those sections. Increase the contrast. Filter out the water distortion. And what emerged made my blood run cold. There wasn't just one creature in the photographs. There were at least 4. Maybe more. Ian hadn't found a solitary creature. He'd found a group. A pod. A hunting pack working together. That changed everything. A single large predator was dangerous. But a group? A coordinated hunting pack? That was exponentially more lethal. That explained how they'd managed to kill 47 people over a century without anyone ever escaping to tell about it. They hunted together. Surrounded prey. Cut off escape routes. Made survival impossible. Ian had figured this out. Had realized he wasn't dealing with one creature but multiple. Had understood the implications. That these weren't just animals. They were intelligent. Social. Capable of coordinated hunting strategies that suggested complex communication and planning. And he'd gone back the next morning. Despite knowing the danger. Despite understanding what he was dealing with. He'd returned to that hunting ground with his camera. To get more evidence. To confirm his theory. To document the full extent of what he'd discovered. Why? Why risk it? The only explanation was that Ian needed to be certain. Needed to have undeniable proof before making his decision about whether to reveal or conceal. Needed to see with his own eyes how the creatures hunted. How they cooperated. How they chose their victims. And something had gone wrong. The creatures had noticed him. Had recognized he was observing them. Had seen him as a threat or as prey. And they'd acted. Patricia had seen the boat rocking violently. Had seen something surface. Had seen the boat left drifting. But what had actually happened in those moments? Had Ian been pulled under? Or had he seen something so terrifying he'd abandoned ship? Swam to shore? Staged his disappearance because he understood revealing these creatures would lead to catastrophe. I needed to know if Ian was alive. If he'd survived that morning. If he was somewhere hiding with the truth he couldn't share. So I started looking for evidence of someone living under a different identity. Someone who'd appeared in late 1987 with no real history. Someone who fit Ian's description. And after 3 months of searching, I found something. A man named William Graham who'd appeared in a small town in the Outer Hebrides in November 1987. Had taken a job as a laborer. Paid cash rent. Kept to himself. No background anyone could verify. And he was the right age. The right build. Had the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. I traveled to the Hebrides. Found the town. Asked around. And when I finally saw William Graham walking down a street, I knew immediately. It was Ian McLeod. Older, thinner, with a beard he hadn't had before, but unmistakably him. I approached carefully, didn't want to spook him, introduced myself, told him I'd been hired by his wife to find him, that I knew what he'd found, that I understood why he'd run. Ian looked at me for a long moment, and then he said 3 words that confirmed everything. "You don't understand." Ian agreed to talk, but not there, not in public. He took me to a small cottage he rented on the outskirts of town. Remote, isolated, no neighbors. And once we were inside, he started talking, telling me everything he'd discovered, everything that had driven him to abandon his life and hide for 6 years. The creatures were intelligent, he confirmed. More intelligent than any animal had a right to be. They hunted in coordinated groups, used strategy, anticipated prey behavior. They weren't just instinctive predators. They were calculating, deliberate, and they'd been hunting humans for far longer than a century. "How do you know?" I asked. "How can you be sure?" "Because I saw their lair," Ian said. "On that final morning, after I photographed them, I followed them. Stayed back far enough they didn't notice. Watched where they went. And they led me to something I should never have seen." He described an underwater cave system near the deepest part of the loch. The creatures had gone into it, disappeared beneath the surface. And Ian, in what he now recognized as madness, had put on diving equipment he kept on his boat and followed them down. The cave entrance was at 200 feet, deep enough to be dangerous, dark enough that he needed powerful lights. But Ian had gone in anyway, followed the passage, and found something that explained everything. The cave opened into a chamber, large, maybe 50 feet across, and the chamber floor was covered in bones. Human bones. Dozens of skeletons. Maybe more. Some recent enough to still have remnants of clothing. Others ancient. Weathered. Centuries old. The creatures had been hunting humans for generations. Probably for thousands of years. This chamber was their feeding ground. Where they brought kills. Where they stored bodies. Where the evidence of their predation had been accumulating for longer than modern civilization. Ian had documented it. Taken photographs. Counted the skeletons he could see. And then he'd gotten out. Surfaced. Returned to his boat. And sat there for an hour trying to process what he'd discovered. He couldn't reveal it. Couldn't tell anyone. Because revealing the creatures meant revealing that chamber. Meant proving that hundreds, maybe thousands of people over the centuries had been killed and eaten by something living in Loch Ness. Meant families getting answers they didn't want. Meant changing how people saw this place forever. But he also couldn't keep fishing there. Couldn't go back to his normal life knowing what he knew. Couldn't pretend everything was fine while creatures hunted in the water he worked every day. So he'd made a decision. He'd cut his anchor. Let his boat drift. Made it look like he'd drowned. And he'd swum to shore miles away where no one would see him. He'd hidden his equipment. His photographs. His diving gear. Everything that connected him to what he'd found. And he'd walked away from his life. Became someone else. Disappeared. "Did you tell Margaret?" I asked. "Does your wife know you're alive?" Ian shook his head. Telling her would mean telling her why I left. And I couldn't do that to her. Couldn't burden her with knowing what's in that water. Couldn't make her complicit in keeping the secret. Better she thinks I drowned. better she can move on with her life. I looked at him. This man who'd given up everything. Who'd lived under a false name for 6 years. Who'd let his wife grieve him. All to keep a secret he thought was too dangerous to reveal. And I had to ask the question that had been haunting me since I started this investigation. Why are you telling me? I asked. Why not just deny you're Ian McLeod? Why risk me revealing the truth? Because, Ian said, someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand why those disappearances happened. Why people keep vanishing from Loch Ness. And someone needs to make sure it stops. How? I asked. How do we stop it without revealing what they are? We can't, Ian said. That's the problem. We can't warn people without explaining why. Can't protect them without admitting the creatures exist. And if we admit that, if we reveal what's down there, the response will be catastrophic. Hunting parties. Military intervention. Attempts to kill or capture them. And the creatures won't let that happen quietly. More people will die. Many more. So what do we do? I asked. Ian looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. That carried knowledge no one should have to carry. And he said something that made me understand the true horror of the situation. We accept it, he said. We accept that some truths can't be shared. Some dangers can't be eliminated. Some deaths will continue happening because preventing them is impossible without causing worse consequences. We accept that the Loch Ness Monster is real and that it kills people. And we live with that knowledge in silence. I left Ian's cottage with more questions than answers. He'd given me the truth. Explained the creatures. Shown me why he'd run. But he hadn't given me any solution. Any way to stop the deaths. Any path forward that didn't end in more tragedy. I drove back to the mainland. Went to my office in Edinburgh. And I sat with the knowledge for 3 days. Thinking. Processing. Trying to decide what to do with everything I'd learned. With the evidence I'd gathered. With the truth Ian had shared. I had the photographs. Both Ian's images showing the creatures and the dead specimen, and my own documentation of his testimony. I had witness statements. Historical records. A pattern of disappearances that proved predation. Everything needed to expose the truth. To force action. To make the world acknowledge what lived in Loch Ness. But doing that meant accepting the consequences. Meant triggering the exact response Ian had warned about. Military intervention. Hunting parties. Attempts to kill creatures that had been here far longer than modern Scotland. Creatures that would defend themselves. That would kill more people in the process. That might escape and establish themselves elsewhere, creating new hunting grounds, new danger zones. And it meant revealing that chamber. Those bones. The evidence of centuries of predation. Meant telling families that their loved ones hadn't drowned accidentally. Had been hunted. Killed. Consumed. Meant opening wounds that had barely healed. Meant destroying the peace people had found in accepting loss as accidental rather than violent. I thought about Margaret MacLeod, Ian's wife, who'd hired me to find her husband, who deserved to know he was alive, who'd grieved for 6 years while Ian lived under a false name. Did she deserve the truth? Did I owe her that truth regardless of the consequences? Or was Ian right? Was it better for her to believe he drowned? To have closure even if it was false? To move on with her life without the burden of knowing what he knew? Without having to keep the same terrible secret? I didn't know. Couldn't decide. So I did something I'd never done in 30 years as an investigator. I sat on the evidence. Didn't file a report. Didn't contact Margaret. Didn't reveal what I discovered. I just held the truth, carried it, and tried to decide if there was any way to use it that wouldn't make things worse. And then, 3 weeks after my visit to Ian, something happened that made the decision for me. A tourist went missing at Loch Ness. A young woman, 23 years old, swimming near Urquhart Bay. Witnesses said she went under, never came back up. Body never recovered. It was September, the hunting season. The creatures were active again, and someone had died. Another victim. Another family destroyed. Another person who could have been saved if people knew the truth. I couldn't sit on the evidence anymore. Couldn't let the deaths continue. I had to do something. Had to find a way to warn people without revealing everything. Had to protect future victims even if it meant partial exposure. So I made a choice. I contacted the Highland Council. Told them I had evidence suggesting Loch Ness was more dangerous than previously understood. That there might be large aquatic predators in the water. That swimming and diving should be restricted during certain seasons. That safety measures needed to be implemented. I didn't mention the creatures directly. Didn't show the photographs. Didn't explain about the hunting pack or the chamber of bones. I just pushed for restrictions. For warnings. For measures that would keep people out of the water during the dangerous periods. They were skeptical. Asked for evidence. I gave them the historical pattern. The 47 disappearances. The seasonal clustering. The geographic concentration. Presented it as data analysis. Statistical anomaly. Risk assessment. Professional investigative findings. And slowly, reluctantly, they started taking it seriously. Started implementing restrictions. Warning signs. Safety campaigns. Not because they believed in monsters, but because the data was compelling enough to warrant precaution. Because preventing deaths was more important than understanding their cause. It wasn't enough. Wasn't a real solution. The creatures were still there. Still hunting. Still dangerous. But at least fewer people would be in the water during their active periods. At least some lives would be saved. At least the risk would be reduced. It was the best I could do. The only compromise between revelation and silence. Between protecting individuals and protecting the truth.